Hello everyone and welcome to our channel. In this video, we will be covering some important topics and questions related to those topics for the DP-300 exam. You can find the complete PDF of this video along with our practice questions through the link down in the description. We here have more than 30 plus certifications and are here to help you achieve your certification goals. We will try to answer all of your doubts related to DP-300 exam, such as the exam does have lab type questions, it does have case study type questions as well. The exam duration is around 120 minutes in which you have to answer 40 to 60 questions. The minimum passing score is 700 out of 1000. There is no negative marking in the exam. This certification will be valid for a year after you earn it. About the exam renewal process, you will have to recertify. This is a tutorial video for the DP-300 exam and contains some practice questions as well. These are the topics that we will be discussing in this video. However, these are not all the topics that will come in the exam. As such, we will be publishing more videos in the future to cover those topics. So please make sure to subscribe our channel and press the bell icon. So our first topic, Azure SQL. What is Azure SQL? It is a family of managed, secure, and intelligent products that use SQL Server database engine in the Azure cloud. Azure SQL is built upon the familiar SQL Server engine, so you can migrate applications with ease and continue to use the tools, languages, and resources you are familiar with. Your skills and experience transfer to the cloud so you can do even more with what you already have. The three products in the Azure SQL family are Azure SQL Database, support modern cloud applications on an intelligent managed database service that includes serverless compute. Azure SQL Managed Instance, modernize your existing SQL Server applications at scale with an intelligent, fully managed instance as a service with almost 100% feature parity with the SQL Server database engine. Best for most migrations to the cloud. SQL Server on Azure virtual machines. Lift and shift your SQL Server workloads with ease and maintain 100% SQL Server compatibility and operating system level access. About the service comparison, as seen in the diagram, each service offering can be characterized by the level of administration you have over the infrastructure and by the degree of cost efficiency. To the questions related to the same topic. Question 1. You have 20 Azure SQL databases provisioned by using the vCore purchasing model. You plan to create an Azure SQL database elastic pool and add the 20 databases. Which three metrics should you use to size the elastic pool to meet the demands of your workload? Each correct answer presents part of the solution. Here in this question, we plan to add our 20 databases in an Azure SQL database elastic pool. And we have to list three metrics which we should use to size the elastic pool. As such, the metrics that we should use are total size of all the databases, number of concurrently peaking databases into peak CPU utilization per database, and total number of databases into average CPU utilization per database. Thus, the correct options are A, C, and E. About option C and E, estimate the vCores needed for the pool as follow. For vCore based purchasing model, max bracket on total number of databases into average vCore utilization per database, number of concurrently peaking databases into peak vCore utilization per database. Bracket off. About option A, Estimate the storage space needed for the pool by adding the number of bytes needed for all the databases in the pool. Question 2. You plan to deploy an app that includes an Azure SQL database and an Azure web app. The app has the following requirements. The web app must be hosted on an Azure virtual network. The Azure SQL database must be assigned a private IP address. The Azure SQL database must allow connections only from a specific virtual network. You need to recommend a solution that meets the requirements. What should you include in the recommendation? Here in this question, we have to deploy an app that includes an Azure SQL database and an Azure web app. The web app must be hosted on Azure Virtual Network, and for the database, it must be assigned a private IP address and must allow connections from only a specific virtual network. As such, considering the requirement, we should recommend Azure Private Link in the solution. Thus, the correct option is A. Private link allows you to connect to various platform as a service services in Azure via a private network. Private endpoint is a private IP address within a specific VNet and subnet. Question 3. You are planning a solution that will use Azure SQL database. Usage of the solution will peak from October 1 to January 1 each year. During peak usage, the database will require the following: 24 cores, 500 GB of storage, 124 GB of memory, more than 50,000 IOPS. During periods of off-peak usage, the service tier of Azure SQL database will be set to standard. Which service tier should you use during peak usage? Here in this question, considering the requirements that are listed during the peak usage, we should use the business critical service tier. Thus, the correct option is A. Business critical, because we have request to scale up and down not only in compute resources but also storage, which is available only in vCore purchasing model. Hyperscale does not suit us well because it is reversible only within 45 days of the original migration to hyperscale. Question 4. You have an on-premises data center that contains a 2 TB Microsoft SQL Server 2019 database named DB1. You need to recommend a solution to migrate DB1 to an Azure SQL managed instance. The solution must minimize downtime and administrative effort. What should you include in the recommendation? Here in this question, we have to migrate our 2 TB database DB1 to an Azure SQL managed instance while minimizing downtime and administrative effort. Considering that, we should include log replay service in our recommendation. Thus, the correct option is A. Answer is A. Less administrative effort compared to transactional replication. To the next topic, SQL Server. What is SQL Server? Microsoft SQL Server is a relational database management system developed by Microsoft. It is designed to run on a central server so that multiple users can access the same data simultaneously. You can install SQL Server on Windows or Linux, deploy it in a Linux container, or deploy it on an Azure virtual machine or other virtual machine platform. You previously might have referred to this as the boxed product. The underlying SQL Server database engine is also used by the following products and services: Azure SQL Database, Azure SQL Managed Instance, Microsoft Analytics Platform System, Azure Synapse Analytics, Azure SQL Edge. SQL Server Architecture. Here, this image gives us a basic idea about the SQL Server's architecture. We will be discussing the components in detail now. First, we have protocol layer. It implements the external interface to SQL Server. PDS is an application layer protocol that is used to transfer data between a database server and a client. Then we have data storage. The main data storage unit is a database, which is a collection of data. The data in the SQL Server database is stored in primary data files with an extension .mdf and secondary data files with an extension .ndf. Log files in SQL Server are recognized with the .idf extension. Then we have buffer management. SQL Server buffers pages in RAM to minimize disk input or output. An 8 KB page could be buffered in memory, and the set of all pages currently buffered is called the buffer cache. Based on available memory, SQL Server decides how many pages will be cached in memory. To the next component, data retrieval. Data retrieval from SQL Server is done using TSQL. SQL Server also allows us to write stored procedures to query the data. Then we have logging and transaction. SQL Server uses a transaction to make sure that any operation either completes or is undone if fails, but never leaves the database in an intermediate state. Any changes made to a page will update the in-memory cache of the page, and simultaneously all the operations performed will be written to a log along with the transaction ID. Sixth, we have concurrency and locking. In SQL Server, we have two modes of concurrency control: pessimistic concurrency and optimistic concurrency. In pessimistic concurrency control, SQL Server controls concurrent access by using locks. In optimistic concurrency control, a new version of a row is created whenever the div row is updated. Both versions of the row are stored and maintained in a system defined database tempdb. To the seventh, SQL CLR. SQL Server 2005 also has a new component named SQL CLR, via which it integrates with .NET Framework. When we write code for SQL CLR, data stored in SQL Server databases can be accessed by using the ADO.NET APIs like any other application that accesses SQL Server data. To the questions related to the same topic. Question 5. You have a Microsoft SQL Server 2017 server. You need to migrate the server to Azure. The solution must meet the following requirements: ensure that the latest version of SQL Server is used, support the SQL Server agent service, minimize administrative effort. What should you use? Here in this question, we have to migrate our server to Azure while ensuring that the latest version of SQL Server is used and while minimizing administrative effort. It should also support the SQL Server agent service. Considering this, we should use the Azure SQL managed instance. Thus, the correct option is D. The answer is D, because ensure that the latest version of SQL Server is used. Only SQL is always in latest version. SQL on virtual machine can be in previous version. Question 6. You have an on-premises Microsoft SQL Server named SQL1 that hosts 5 databases. You need to migrate the databases to an Azure SQL managed instance. The solution must minimize downtime and prevent data loss. What should you use? Here in this question, we have to migrate our five databases to an Azure SQL managed instance while minimizing downtime and preventing data loss. Considering this, we should use backup and restore. Thus, the correct option is B. DMA does not support database migrations to Azure SQL managed instance. Recommendation is to use the Azure SQL migration extension for Azure Data Studio, which supports both online and offline database migrations to Azure SQL managed instance. But here we don't have the option Azure SQL migration extensions for Azure Data Studio. Regarding the log shipping to managed instance is not possible. It only supports the restore of full backups. Question 7. You have a Microsoft SQL Server 2019 database named DB1 that uses the following database level and instance level features: clustered column store indexes, automatic tuning, change tracking, polybase. You plan to migrate DB1 to an Azure SQL database. Which feature should be removed or replaced before DB1 can be migrated? Here in this question, the features that our database has are clustered column store indexes, automatic tuning, change tracking, and polybase. As we are migrating DB1 to an Azure SQL database, a feature that should be removed or replaced before it can be migrated is polybase. Thus, the correct option is B. Question 8. You have an Azure SQL database that contains a table named fact sales. Fact sales contains the column shown in the following table. Fact sales has 6 billion rows and is loaded nightly by using a batch process. You must provide the greatest reduction in space for the database and maximize performance. Which type of compression provides the greatest space reduction for the database? Here in this question, our fact sales table has 6 billion rows and is loaded nightly by using a batch process. In order to provide the greatest reduction in space and maximize performance, we should use the column store archival compression. Thus, the correct option is D. Column store tables and indexes are always stored with column store compression. You can further reduce the size of the column store data by configuring an additional compression called archival compression. To the next topic, Azure Synapse. What is Azure Synapse? It is an enterprise analytics service that accelerates time to insight across data warehouses and big data systems. Azure Synapse brings together the best of SQL technologies used in enterprise data warehousing, Spark technologies used for big data, Data Explorer for log and time series analytics, pipelines for data integration, and ETL/ELT, and deep integration with other Azure services such as Power BI, Cosmos DB, and Azure ML. About Synapse Notebooks, a notebook in Azure Synapse Analytics is a web interface for you to create files that contain live code, visualizations, and narrative text. Notebooks are a good place to validate ideas and use quick experiments to get insights from your data. Notebooks are also widely used in data preparation, data visualization, machine learning, and other big data scenarios. With a Synapse notebook, you can get started with zero setup effort, help keep data secure with built in enterprise security features, analyze data across raw formats, processed file formats, and SQL tabular data files against Spark and SQL. Be productive with enhanced authoring capabilities and built-in data visualization. To the questions related to the same topic, you are designing a data dimension table in an Azure Synapse Analytics dedicated SQL pool. A date dimension table will be used by all the fact tables. Which distribution type should you recommend to minimize data movement? Here in this question, our date dimension table will be used by all the fact tables. Considering our requirement to minimize data movement, we should use the distribution type of replicate. Thus, the correct option is B. A replicated table has a full copy of the table available on every compute node. Queries run faster on replicated tables since joins on replicated tables don't require data movement. Replication requires extra storage, though, and isn't practical for large tables. Question 10. You have an Azure Synapse Analytics workspace named WS1 that contains an Apache Spark pool named Pool1. You plan to create a database named DB1 in Pool1. You need to ensure that when tables are created in DB1, the tables are available automatically as external tables to the built-in serverless SQL pool. Which format should you use for the tables in DB1? Here in this question, we have a Synapse Analytic workspace named Workspace1 and an Apache Spark pool named Pool1. We are planning to create a database in that Pool1. We need to ensure that when tables are created, they are available automatically as external tables to the built-in serverless SQL pool. Based on this requirement, we should use the Parquet format. Thus, the correct option is C. Serverless SQL pool can automatically synchronize metadata from Apache Spark. A serverless SQL pool database will be created for each database existing in serverless Apache Spark pools. For each Spark external table based on Parquet and located in Azure Storage, an external table is created in a serverless SQL pool database. As such, you can shut down your Spark pools and still query Spark external tables from serverless SQL pool. Question 11. You are designing an anomaly detection solution for streaming data from an Azure IoT hub. The solution must meet the following requirements: send the output to an Azure Synapse, identify spikes and dips in time series data, minimize development and configuration effort. What should you include in the solution? Here in this question, our anomaly detection solution must meet the requirements of sending the output to an Azure Synapse, identifying spikes and dips in time series data, and minimizing development and configuration effort. Considering these requirements, we should include Azure Stream Analytics in the solution. Thus, the correct option is C. Anomalies can be identified by routing data via IoT Hub to a built-in ML model in Azure Stream Analytics. Question 12. You have an Azure Synapse Analytics Apache Spark pool named Pool1. You plan to load JSON files from an Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 container into the tables in Pool1. The structure and data types vary by file. You need to load the files into the tables. The solution must maintain the source data types. What should you do? Here in this question, we are planning to load JSON files from an data lake storage Gen 2 container into the tables in pool 1. The structure and data types vary by file. We need to load the files into the table while maintaining the source data type. Considering this requirement, we should load the data by using PySpark. Thus, the correct option is A. Synapse notebooks support four Apache Spark languages: PySpark, Spark, Spark SQL, and .NET Spark. To the miscellaneous questions. Question 13. You have a Microsoft SQL Server 2019 instance in an on-premises data center. The instance contains a 4 TB database named DB1. You plan to migrate DB1 to an Azure SQL database managed instance. What should you use to minimize downtime and data loss during the migration? Here in this question, we are planning to migrate our 4 table database named DB1 to an Azure SQL database managed instance while minimizing downtime and data loss during the migration. As such, we should use Azure Database Migration Service. Thus, the correct option is D. Azure Database Migration Service can do online migrations with minimal downtime. When you migrate databases to Azure by using it, you can do an offline or an online migration. With an offline migration, application downtime starts when the migration starts. With an online migration, downtime is limited to the time to cut over at the end of migration. We suggest that you test an offline migration to determine whether the downtime is acceptable. If not, do an online migration. Question 14. Hotspot. You have an on-premises Microsoft SQL Server 2016 server named Server 1 that contains a database named DB1. You need to perform an online migration of DB1 to an Azure SQL database managed instance by using Azure Database Migration Service. How should you configure the backup of DB1? To answer, select the appropriate options in the answer area. To the answer area, backup type. Here, the correct option is full and log backups only. To the next statement, backup option. Here, the correct option is with checksum. About the options, box 1, make sure to take every backup on a separate backup media. Azure Database Migration Service does not support backups that are appended to a single backup file. Take full backup and log backups to separate backup files. About box 2, Azure Database Migration Service uses the backup and restore method to migrate your on-premises databases to SQL managed instance. Azure Database Migration Service only supports backups created using checksum. Question 15. You are designing a streaming data solution that will ingest variable volumes of data. You need to ensure that you can change the partition count after creation. Which service should you use to ingest the data? Here in this question, we are designing a streaming data solution that will ingest variable volumes of data and have to ensure that we can change the partition count after creation. Considering this requirement, we should use Azure Event Hubs dedicated to ingest the data. Thus, the correct option is D. The partition count for an event hub in a dedicated event hubs cluster can be increased after the event hub has been created. Question 16. You are creating a new notebook in Azure Databricks that will support R as the primary language but will also support Scala and SQL. Which switch should you use to switch between languages? Here in this question, we should use the percentage pointed bracket on language pointed bracket off switch to switch between languages. Thus, the correct option is B. You can override the default language by specifying the language magic command percentage pointed bracket language at the beginning of a cell. The supported magic commands are percentage Python, percentage R, percentage Scala, and percentage SQL. Question 17. You plan to build a structured streaming solution in Azure Databricks. The solution will count new events in 5-minute intervals and report only events that arrive during the interval. The output will be sent to a Delta Lake table. Which output mode should you use? Here in this question, we are planning to build a structured streaming solution in Azure Databricks that will count new events in 5-minute intervals and report only the events that arrive during that interval. The output will be sent to a data lake table. Considering this, we should use the append output mode. Thus, the correct option is B. Question 18. You have an Azure Databricks workspace named Workspace 1 in the standard pricing tier. Workspace 1 contains an all purpose cluster named Cluster 1. You need to reduce the time it takes for Cluster 1 to start and scale up. The solution must minimize costs. What should you do first? Here in this question, we have a cluster named Cluster 1 in Workspace 1, and we have to reduce the time it takes for it to start and scale up while minimizing costs. Considering this, we should create a pool in Workspace 1. Thus, the correct option is C. You can use Databricks pools to speed up your data pipelines and scale clusters quickly. Databricks pools are managed cache of virtual machine instances that enables clusters to start and scale 4 times faster. Question 19. You have an Azure Synapse Analytics dedicated SQL pool that contains a table named Table 1. You have files that are ingested and loaded into an Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 container named Container 1. You plan to insert data from the files into Table 1 and transform the data. Each row of data in the files will produce one row in the serving layer of Table 1. You need to ensure that when the source data files are loaded to Container 1, the date time is stored as an additional column in Table 1. Solution. In an Azure Synapse Analytics pipeline, you use a get metadata activity that retrieves the date time of the files. Does this meet the goal? Here in this question, we have table 1 in Azure Synapse Analytics dedicated SQL pool and container 1 in Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2. We have to insert data from the files in container 1 to table 1 and transform the data. Each row of data in the files will produce one row in the serving layer of table 1. We have to ensure that when the files are loaded to container 1, that date time is stored as an additional column in table 1. Considering this, the given solution is correct. Thus, the correct option is A. You can use the get metadata activity to retrieve the metadata of any data in Azure Data Factory or a Synapse pipeline. You can use the output from this activity in conditional expression to perform validation or consume the metadata in subsequent activities. Question 20, Hotspot. You have an on-premises Microsoft SQL Server 2019 instance that hosts a database named DB1. You plan to perform an online migration of DB1 to an Azure SQL managed instance by using the Azure Database Migration Service. You need to create a backup of DB1 that is accessible to the Azure Database Migration Service. What should you run for the backup? And where should you store the backup? To answer, select the appropriate option in the answer area. Note, each correct selection is worth 1 point. To the answer area, run. Here, the correct option is a full backup and a log backup to separate files by using the with checksum option. To the next statement, store the backup in. Here, the correct option is an SMB file share. About the options, box 1, Azure Database Migration Service does not initiate any backups and instead uses existing backups which you may already have as part of your disaster recovery plan for the migration. Be sure that you take backups using the with checksum option. About box 2, for online migrations from SQL Server to SQL managed instance using Azure Database Migration Service, you must provide the full database backup and subsequent log backups in the SMB network share that the service can use to migrate your database. Question 21. You have an on premises Microsoft SQL Server 2019 server that hosts a database named DB1. You have an Azure subscription that contains an Azure SQL managed instance named SQL MI1 and a virtual network named VNet1. SQL MI1 resides on VNet1. The on premises network connects to VNet1 by using an express route connection. You plan to migrate DB1 to SQLMI1 by using Azure Database Migration Service. You need to configure VNet1 to support the migration. What should you do? Here in this question, we have a database named DB1, an Azure SQL managed instance named SQLMI1, and a virtual network named VNet1. SQLMI1 resides on VNet1. The on-premises network connects to VNet1 by using an express route connection. We have to migrate DB1 to SQLMI1 using Azure Database Migration Service and have to configure VNet1 to support the migration. As such, we should configure service endpoints. Thus, the correct option is A. During virtual network setup, if you use express route with network peering to Microsoft, add the following service endpoints to the subnet in which the service will be provisioned: target database endpoint, storage endpoint, service bus endpoint. And this configuration is necessary because Azure Database Migration Service lacks internet connectivity. Question 22. You have an on premises Microsoft SQL server that uses the file tables and file stream features. You plan to migrate to Azure SQL. Which service should you use? Here in this question, we have to migrate our on-premises SQL server that uses file tables and file stream features to Azure SQL. Considering this, we should use the SQL Server on an Azure virtual machine service. Thus, the correct option is B. Your business might have requirements that make SQL Server on Azure virtual machines a more suitable target than Azure SQL database. If one of the following condition applies to your database, consider moving to a SQL Server virtual machine instead. You have strict dependency on features that are still not supported, such as file stream or file table, polybase, and cross instance transactions. Question 23. You have an Azure SQL database named DB1. You have a table named Table1 and that has 20 columns of type car 400. Row compression for Table 1 is enabled. During a database audit, you discover that none of the fields contain more than 150 characters. You need to ensure that you can apply page compression to Table 1. What should you do? Here in this question, we have a database named DB1 and a table named Table1 with 20 columns of type char 400. Row compression for Table 1 is enabled. We need to ensure that we can apply page compression to Table 1. Considering this requirement, we should configure the column type to for char 200. Thus, the correct option is D. We reduce the max length of the column from 400 to 200. This is because most of them are using up to 150 characters only. Question 24. You have an Azure subscription that contains an Azure SQL database. The database contains a table named Table1 that uses partitioned column stores. You need to configure Table1 to meet the following requirements. Each partition must be compressed. The compression ratio must be maximized. You must be able to index the compressed data. What should you use? Here in this question, we have a table named Table1 that uses partitioned column stores. We have the following requirements for Table 1. Each partition must be compressed, the compression ratio must be maximized, and we must be able to index the compressed data. Considering these requirements, we should use column store compression. As such, the correct option is B. While column store archival compression can be used to compress column store data in a way that minimizes storage costs, it is not optimized for query performance as it is designed for long-term storage of cold data. In this scenario, the requirement is to maximize compression ratio while still being able to perform index operations on the compressed data. Column store archival compression is not optimized for indexing and as such it would not meet this requirement. Therefore, the correct answer is B, column store compression. Question 25. You have an Azure subscription linked to an Azure AD tenant. The subscription contains 10 virtual machines that run Windows Server 2019 and host Microsoft SQL Server 2019 instances. You need to ensure that you can manage the SQL Server instances by using a single user account. What should you do first? Here in this question, we have 10 virtual machines running Windows Server 2019 and hosting Microsoft SQL Server 2019 instances. We need to ensure that we can manage SQL Server instances using a single user account. Considering this requirement, we should deploy an Azure AD domain services domain and join the virtual machines to the domain. Thus, the correct option is B. Question 26. You have an Azure subscription. You need to deploy a new Azure SQL database by using Azure command line interface. Which three parameters are required? Here in this question, the three parameters that are required are name, resource group, and server. Thus, the correct option is C. Question 27. You have an Azure subscription. You need to deploy an Azure SQL database. The solution must meet the following requirements: dynamically scale CPU resources, ensure that the database can be paused to reduce costs. What should you use? Here in this question, we need to deploy an Azure SQL database. Our solution must be able to dynamically scale CPU resources and ensure that databases can be paused to reduce costs. Considering this, we should use the serverless compute tier. Thus, the correct option is B. Question 28. You have an on premises Microsoft SQL Server 2019 database named SQL1 that uses merge replication. You need to migrate SQL1 to Azure. Which service should you use? Here in this question, we have an on premises SQL Server named SQL1 that uses merge replication, and we have to migrate it to Azure. Considering this, we should use the SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machines service. As such, the correct option is C. Question 29. Drag drop. You have an Azure SQL database named DB1. You need to create a partition table in DB1. Which three objects should you create in sequence? To answer, move the appropriate objects from the list of objects to the answer area and arrange them in the correct order. The objects that are provided to us are a partition scheme, an aligned index, a file group, a table, a partition function. To the answer area, the correct sequence of these objects is a partition function, a partition scheme, and a table. Question 30. You have an on premises Microsoft SQL Server 2019 instance that hosts a database named DB1. You have an Azure subscription that contains an Azure SQL database named SQL DB1. You need to replicate DB1 to SQL DB1. Which type of replication should you use? Here in this question, we have a SQL Server 2019 instance that is hosting a database named DB1 and an Azure subscription containing an Azure SQL database named SQL DB1. We need to replicate DB1 to SQL DB1. Considering this, we should use the transactional replication type. Thus, the correct option is A. These were all the questions for this video. You can find the complete PDF of this video and our practice questions through the link down in the description. Please make sure to subscribe our channel and press the bell icon. Thank you for watching and stay tuned.